Welcome to the Hanu Health Podcast, where our mission is to help you to breathe better and stress less. On this show, we discuss a variety of topics and provide practical suggestions for improving health and well-being. However, none of the education, tips, and tricks provided should be taken as medical advice. Your medical doctor is your best bet if you have medical questions. Also, on this podcast, we interview numerous guests from diverse backgrounds, interests, and may carry some unique ideas. Hanu Health as a company does not endorse all statements provided by guests or condone all suggestions or protocols discussed. We just like hearing about cool people doing rad and new things. So sit back, relax, breathe, and enjoy the show. Jacko, what's going on, man? Welcome to the Hanu Health Podcast. So glad you could join me today, man.
Yeah, man. I'd be happier to be where you are. Like in England right now, it's fairly wet and it's raining, but happy to be here virtually. But ideally, it'd be nice to actually be out on the other side of the pond.
Yeah, indeed, man. I went out on a run this morning and it's like 55 degrees, which for me, like running temp wise, like I love when it's in like the mid 50s, low 60s. That's like perfect temperature for me. And, I'm in the South and the, southern east part of the United States in South Carolina. And, the summer was just brutal here in the 90s. And so today was like a huge reprieve. I was like, oh man, 55 degrees. Yeah. Putting on the running shoes. I was planning on doing it anyway. I was like, I'm headed out there. So yeah, man, it's pretty nice over here, which, I feel like you said it was, raining and cold, where you are in the UK. I feel like that's what everybody tells me it always is in the UK. Is that true? It's just always rainy and cold?
No, it's not. We've had, it's weird. The summer seems to come early now, but I can't complain too much. I did a marathon for the first time ever on Saturday.
Oh, look at you, man. Nice.
It was like 14 degrees. It was on the coast, like an off-road trail on the coast, in Suffolk, and it was the weather. I remember we were running along, chatting to some guys who were like sort of like 20k in or something like that, and I was like, like looking out over the sea, and the sun was like coming through the clouds, like it was quite overcast, but it was like, guys, like it could have been pissing it down. Like we are so lucky, and it's not too hot at all. It was just nice. So we have our days every now and again in the UK.
Yeah, no, I hear you, man, dude. A marathon, congrats! Like, what got you to that level of masochism where you're like, you know what, I'm gonna put myself through this grueling thing?
It's interesting. I've had a few days to reflect on it. I've been writing a blog a bit about it, and it probably helps tell a bit of a story about me in a way, in that I played sports like as a kid, everything, rugby, football. You don't really have rugby too much in America, but just think like American football, but no pads and helmets and that type of stuff.
Just way more hardcore.
I don't know whether that's true. Just way more sort of like just weird.
Right.
But we played a ton of sport, tennis and stuff as well, and then sort of relatively early, and I guess it happens in America probably even more sort of severe, in that you get sort of into like a path, and so mine was rugby. I'd have probably preferred to have played football. You get paid a lot more to play football in the UK, but I wasn't good enough. But I was all right at rugby and signed like a professional contract, my first one at like 18 years old, and then I retired at 31 through a head injury. I had a seizure on the field and bleed on the brain, and like a bad sort of time, and that actually led me into some of the breathing stuff. But just when I was younger, I almost the idea of doing a marathon, like I loved running and that type of stuff, and cross country at school, and the idea of a marathon, I think I just like it was almost like an assumption of like that's something that's on the bucket list of. Almost like that's something everyone's got to have a crack at some point in your life, type of thing. And my excuse of never having done one, even though I wanted to, as a bit of just a test, almost like, can you just endure that? Like how bad is it, or what's it like? My excuse was always, well, we weren't allowed to do other stuff that would, that wouldn't help my rugby training, because it's just too far, too long, too much endurance. And anyway. I retired from rugby in 2013 from this head injury, and it took me a year to be able to run without getting some of my head injury, brain injury symptoms like headaches and nausea and those types of things. But I managed to run a year later without getting some headaches. I did my first 10K in 2015, but that brought all my symptoms back for a few days. So I just pushed it far too much. But I got to the point last Christmas when it was a bit of a weird conversation because it was just really with me in my head where I had this realization like, you have said you always wanted to do a marathon. And your excuse was you couldn't because you were playing rugby. It was like 8 years since you retired. Like, what are you doing? So I literally went on the internet. I didn't want to do a road one because I like being in nature.
Sure. Yeah.
Concrete on the knees and all that sort of stuff. So I was like, found a coastal off-road jobby, and I was like, that's me. And the beauty of the internet, you can just do impulse stupid things, and it was like,
right.
signed up for a marathon.
I love it, man. Yeah, the thing about it is too, and like for me, like I've always kind of had it a little bit in my head that like if I just kind of like impulsively sign up for something, like it was like initially like I'm super pumped about it, but also too like it can scare me a little bit because I'm like, oh well, I've got to put in the time and the effort to kind of bust my chops in order to train for it because I don't want to go out there and it be just an absolute train wreck or I can't finish or whatever it may be. And I've done that in the past for many different types of events. But no, dude, kudos to you for finishing. Did you hit kind of your time that you wanted to get?
I probably should have done a little bit more investigation into it. So it turns out that a marathon is 26.2 miles, right?
Right, like, that's right.
That's a standard thing. Well, this marathon was 27 miles. And I was like, well, that's a bit annoying.
It's an interesting marathon. Just throw you a little curveball there.
I was like, ow. And then where it is in Suffolk, like in your head, when you think of this area of England, like on the east of England, it's like, there are no hills. It's flat.
Yeah.
There was like 300 meters of elevation. And I was like, it's not quite as flat as I thought. So, and my training, having that as a thing to work towards, it was definitely like the amount of training I did. And me and my wife do a lot of like, us running together. She did the half marathon. And yeah, you've got that thing knocking on the door. It's like, and when it's a long way away, it's like, 9 months away or something. When I first signed up, it's like, there's a marathon, but I'm far away, so I'm just going to stay here in the background and maybe go out for a little run.
I think that's all of us, man.
Like, I was steady at a 5K. And to put sort of context to it, my 5K time was sort of like, my PB was like 19 minutes something, and 10K was like 43. So if people do running, they'll know whether that'll be either they'll think that's good or they'll think that's crap. It's all relative, right? But
Indeed.
I would be the guy that would like, I'd go over the finish line and I'd be throwing up, like I would just kill myself. And I was not efficient with my breathing or anything at all. And this is where like the oxygen advantage has been like on two elements for me, like life-changing in rehabilitation fully of my brain through restoring blood supply and oxygen flow to the brain by actually restoring those dysfunctional breathing patterns that had happened from the brain injury. But for years, I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't know that I didn't know like for 3 years after my head injury, I didn't even know that my breathing had changed. Or to be honest, I have no markers pre-head injury other than I was very, very fit at rugby to know whether how dysfunctional my breathing was pre-head injury or if it was all just because of it. But we know when people have concussions, the respiratory center of the brain gets affected, blood supply and oxygen supply does get affected. So I didn't know this at the time. I stumbled across the oxygen advantage through just a bit of I don't know, I think almost like my intuition started to go like, once you ask yourself the question, like, are you breathing right? And you're like, I don't know. So I'm like a strength and conditioning coach as well. So been working with a lot of athletes for a little while and know the body sort of reasonably well from the training perspective to just go, well, I don't know, but like if I say, we can breathe 20, 25,000 or whatever the, times per day. And if we think of that being a movement pattern, well, just like a squat is a movement pattern, if I did 20,000 bad squats a day, I know my hips and my knees and things would be in pieces. Yeah. So the idea of doing something really badly, as small as breathing might be, just because the sheer volume of work that you do, I was like, if I'm not doing it right, then that would be a problem. And that isn't. Right. And then it starts exploring that like rabbit hole, and then you're like, oh, crikey. But
So that's so interesting that you kind of intuitively came across that, because I feel like not many people would. So,
I just felt something wasn't quite right. I didn't get back to my like full sort of, I always felt like, this is the way to express it. It felt like you ever pull off in your car and you've slightly got the handbrake on and you just don't realize, and you're like,
yeah.
It felt like that. It's like I'm going,
Drag.
and I'm doing all right, and everyone would look at me and go, "Oh, you've made a full recovery, Jacko. You look great." And it's like it just felt like the handbrake was slightly on, and yeah, I just started to explore a few things. Breathing ticked that box of like it's going on in the background. It happens sort of automatically, but I could do something about this. The difficulty I stumbled across, and why I was so glad I sort of found the Oxygen Advantage, was that to answer that question, am I breathing right? Not even like how do I do it? It was I wasn't really getting many answers, because some of you go, you need to breathe with your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is your number one breathing muscle. Like, okay, great. How do I do that? And then after that, I try. So you watch a YouTube video or whatever, and you're like, okay, and I'll be like, how do I know if I'm doing it right? Like these types of things just led me further and further to keep sort of digging into it. And it's one of those things of being, like, it's almost like before you're like blissfully unaware. Yeah. It's not a good place to be, but it's sort of, sometimes it's like, it's okay. Or you almost think like, like now I'm like, oh crikey, like you but you know that if you're not getting your breathing right, it has the potential to affect flipping everything.
Right. It's so interesting, because I feel like so many people who are in this space of breath work kind of came upon it in just such new and unique ways. Like I think about James Nestor and how, for him as an investigative journalist, he came across it, first with free diving. And so he was kind of exploring. He's like, man, how in the world are these free divers like holding their breath and like such substantial times, taking themselves down to crazy depths? Like it's insane. And he's like, and then afterwards, they'll just drink and smoke and like they're kind of just living like this, whatever else. I'm like, yeah, it's a good question. And then that his book Deep kind of led him to the book Breath, which is just so intriguing to me. And so I think it's kind of the same way for you, right? Is a personal kind of almost like investigative journalist hat that you had to put on, because you're like, I've got this major problem that has kind of come from concussion. And now for me, I really need to figure out like, what's the missing piece here? And I find that so many people that I've worked with in the past, because, I used to work as a psychologist for the Department of Veteran Affairs, and I did some rotations in like rehab clinics for veterans with TBI. It's just a huge problem, concussions and TBI amongst the veteran military population. And like, they'll assess things kind of like their overall, mood and well-being, which is good. They'll assess things like nutrition, kind of activity level, but breathing was not really one that we saw addressed. Yeah. And it's insane.
I got told, yeah, you're from looking at your brain scan, you should make a full recovery. Yeah. And how long? And my question is obviously like, well, how long is that going to take? Yeah. And the answer was like, well, we don't know. Just it was effectively like, just wait. Just don't try and do anything. Like you'd read a book and it would hurt you, or you look at the TV and it hurts your eyes. And so it was like, just do nothing. And it's hard, like to do nothing, and it's depressing to do nothing. And
sure.
Like there is stuff that we can do, and in terms of our breathing, that I don't know if you come, Dr. Cobb at Z Health Performance, he's done some great work in that area. Like. And I think that for people, like when you feel like you're doing something, it mentally, it massively helps. And the other thing is, one of the worst, I think, injuries or issues or times in our lives that I've certainly experienced, and I have this conversation with other people as well. It doesn't have to be to do with the concussions or whatever, but it's when there's like, it's the unknown element. So for me, it was like, I don't know if I'm going to make a full recovery or how long, and just the unknownness of that. Whereas when I broke my arm or my shoulder or my foot, like doc was like, right, you do this, 12 weeks, that many weeks, and you got a plan. Whereas when you've got no plan for something, it's like, it's just mentally brutal for us. And when you don't, when you haven't got anything to do, I think that's massively challenging. So I encourage people, if they have come across any experience with it, that there is things, we don't just have to just sit and wait.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we can find ourselves feeling so helpless and hopeless in those situations, right? Because, if we have an acute injury, like you mentioned, like we break our arm, we know that for the most part, as long as it's set correctly and, it heals as it should, like we're going to make a full recovery. But when it comes to things like TBI or concussion, when it comes to things like, I think like people who have been exposed to kind of like toxins, heavy metal toxins or mold or Lyme disease, like there's always this kind of question of like, what if I never kind of get back to myself? That's a very stressful, anxiety provoking, depressing place to be. And I could only imagine kind of for you in that situation that you would go there, because physiologically we know that people with TBI and concussion have a much higher propensity to depression physiologically, but then also psychologically, if you're trying to battle with this, like, is my body and mind ever going to go back to normal? Or is this my new normal? And if this is my new normal, like, can I live with this? And I mean, that can drive someone absolutely bonkers, maybe even to the point of them thinking, I don't know if I want to live like this. I mean, it's reasonable to understand why someone would take themselves to that place. So how did you get through it? Was it kind of the breathwork experience and that kind of journey, or was there something kind of spiritual for you? What was it for you?
I guess God was definitely in it for me in terms of like it. One of the weird things was like I was the specialist, the neurologist or the neurosurgeon, whoever that I saw in the end, that had all my MRI results and that sort of stuff. And this was about 3 months after the actual injury had happened. And initially I was trying to get back to playing rugby. It was I was in a bad place. And yeah, the weird thing was I was actually mentally not strong enough to put my hand up and go like, guys, I'm not right. Like, I'm retiring. I'm giving up. Like, I know. Whereas, I've never seen like quitting at something I'd always previously seen as like quitting as a bad thing, and generally like giving up and quitting on things is generally sort of bad. But there's a time and a place for it to be the best decision. And unfortunately, I wasn't mentally strong enough at that point in my life to make that right decision. But I was lucky that the results were so basically I'm like praying that she's going to like say, you can't do this no more. And she says to me, she's really worried that like, she's like, I'm really, really sorry. Like, you can't play like your sport anymore. Like, it's just too dangerous. Like, it sounded sort of like dramatic in like the newspapers when they had it was true that like you if you got another bad one, you could die. Like, that would be the worst case scenario. But the same as, if anyone gets your first head injury could kill you if it was really bad, if you was in a car.
Yeah, of course. Anyway,
but yeah, it's that was the sort of a state of playing. So she was like really sort of almost like you could tell she was a bit worried about giving this and I'm like, sort of thanks, like the relief of like, okay, I wanted you to make that decision for me, not me.
Indeed, because for you, if you had to be the one to say like, I'm going to make that decision, then it's almost like, well, am I taking away my own identity? Am I kind of digging my own grave? And that's a tough place to be. I work with a lot of professional and elite athletes, and the hardest thing for them is kind of like when to say like, I'm done, because for them, especially if they've lived a life where they've only been involved in that sport ever since they were little kids, and now they're in their early mid-30s, whatever it may be, and they're like, okay, now I'm about to take away like a piece of me that I identify as, a piece of me that pretty much everybody sees me as this high-performing athlete. Like, what am I after that? Like, what's there left for me? And so it's kind of good too sometimes. Like, obviously we don't want anybody to have concussions or TBIs or anything kind of that nature, that type of injury, but it is helpful sometimes for a physician or somebody to step in and be like, listen, like, for the sake of your health and well-being, if you want to continue going on, like, and repair yourself, like, you got to stop this, because if you don't, like, there can be serious ramifications. And we've seen that, in American football with, a lot of players who we knew had, TBI. We knew they had concussions, multiple concussions. They kept on playing, and then they died really young because of the significant impact on the brain and on the skull. So yeah, it's one of those things that, I hate it for you that you had to, basically give up, your sport, but it was good that you did have somebody who kind of like you listened to, you trusted, who said, the time is now. Like, and if the time isn't now,
well, it was black. It was black and white from there. Yeah. They've got some like in rugby there was no like laws or rules to like govern whether I could have still ignored them and done what I wanted. But in boxing, if a professional boxer can't take a standing 10 count, they have to have an MRI apparently. And if anything comes up on their MRI like I'd had, then they take their license away from them. So she was like, you know, that's what it would be. That if you were a boxer, that's what the situation would be. It'd be took away from you anyway. Like, and basically like, yeah, I'm making this decision for you. Which, yes, I mean, it's been very. The whole identity thing that you picked up on is like really important. That was something I was battled with for a long time, and was aware of it whilst I was playing, but sort of like difficult to grapple with. Of trying to go like, you know, when you meet people for the first time, you always ask you know, the first question after like, what's your name tends to be like, what do you do as a job? And like, I almost used to feel embarrassed by saying, oh, I just didn't want to. I didn't want to have that conversation of like the rugby player. It's like, let's just talk about life, like rather than going down. That's just one part, you know, like it's just one part of what someone does. But yeah, we often get wrapped up in that. And the challenge that I always found was that if my identity was in me being the rugby player, when I played well at the weekend, great. But when I played badly at the weekend, it was like bad. And so my life at times was this roller coaster of week to week. And my wife had to deal with like happy Jacko when we won or played well, and then like miserable me it's just not like that's not what life's about.
Sure.
Me, but that was a learning process. And through this, I've also, you know, I look at quitting, failure, and giving up in a different light now of like just putting it on the table. Like it used to never be on the table. Whereas now if I'm in a situation, you go like, okay, there's carry on and grit your teeth, and there's give up. Like the marathon, for example, I didn't give up, but if I got to the point where there was a significant reason of like, I don't know, say I like twisted my ankle halfway around and I'm like hobbling around, and then there comes a point where you go, right, the best decision now might be to give up rather than just like completely, like you've already wrecked your ankle, rather than completely destroying it. Or, you know, there's times and a place for it, and that's something that there's been a good learning point for me. In terms of like the breathwork side of it, there was no advice given to me like around or understanding from the people that I was working with that, okay, we actually need to look at your breathing, and we need to look at your CO2 tolerance. We need to look at like how your how this injury has affected your breathing, and can we do some work to try and restore that. That only came. So it was a few years later.
Indeed. So when you did come across it a few years later, so you know you had the sustained injury, plenty of symptoms that you've mentioned, kind of that corresponded with the injury. You came across, you know, breathwork, oxygen advantage. Like, what was it that you started practicing, and then what was it that you started noticing? And were these results immediate for you, or were they kind of like sustained or compounding across time? Tell me a little bit of that story.
Interesting. Like it's still. Sustained and learning and carrying on literally week by week or month by month. I feel like there's always something to like the skill of breathing, to think of it as like a skill and like Nestor calls it like the lost art.
Indeed.
It's not something that you my current thoughts on it are that like it's not something that you complete. It's not like a computer game where you get to the end and you completed it. I'm not going to think about that again. Like I don't need to do anything. Like, yeah, we want to try to create some like habits and some tones so like your automatic state is better. But there's always a time and place to be able to like hone and practice a skill, and thinking of it as a skill or just this thing for the body. It's so important. But the challenge, it's like the double-edged sword of it is it can happen automatically, so you can just leave it alone and you won't die. Whereas if I don't eat some food, like at some point I'm going to die. Like I've got to put it in my mouth. I don't automatically eat. Like I might get hungry automatically, but I don't automatically eat. And so it has this double-edged sword to it, which I think is interesting, and is for some people can be a bit of a barrier to actually like getting involved in it. Like I had a client, I worked with a private GP here who if she gets some clients that she works quite holistically, like a sort of lifestyle medicine, functional medicine type of style of approach with it, looking at like the whole sort of holistic thing and trying to find some like root causes. And if she notices somebody's got she notices their breathing's a bit dysfunctional, she'll refer them on to me. And it might be that they're struggling with like the stress, anxiety or digestion stuff. And she thinks improving their breathing is going to help. And I had one guy that was like, after his first session, he was like, this has been life changing. He was like, this is incredible. And I was like, okay, steady on. Like, it was only, we only done one session, don't worry.
Right.
It's going to get better. But he was like, and he was like, don't take this the wrong way, Jacko. But when the doc like referred me on to do something about breathing, he was like, what's breathing going to do for me? Like, I do that automatically. Like he was open-minded enough to actually give it a go.
Yeah.
He was like, I was properly shut off from it.
Right, which is incredible because some don't. I mean, some they hear this idea of like breathing as being, kind of a helpful cause agent to mental and physical health, and they just write it off. I think the greatest thing that we have is we have people like you, Jacko. We have people like, Patrick McCune. We have people like James Nestor. We have a lot of these, prominent individuals who are really placing breath work at kind of like the spotlight right now and saying, like, it's just not something that's just kind of like this, woo-woo science, like just thing that we're like, oh, this is a beautiful thing that yogis do. Like, no, this is the thing that everybody does. And the problem, though, is that many of us are very dysfunctional when it comes to breathing. And if we continue that dysfunctional pattern of breathing, then it's not going to help us out in all these other health areas. And I love that, again, we're getting a little bit more spotlight around why breath work is so important. But like your story resonates with me. I know you just started the story, but your story resonates with me because I've had so many individuals who come to me, and then when I tell them a little bit about what like heart rate variability training is or heart rate variability biofeedback is, I'm like, honestly, like at the core of it, this is breathwork training. We just use technology as an objective means to show you like what's being changed. So it's incredible.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so, for some people, if they don't have some sort of like markers or feedback or whatever, it's a tool to help us, like I was saying, that question of like, am I doing it right? Like that can be some tools to show you, you are doing it right. And there are simple things for people in terms of like, if you're trying to create more of a parasympathetic state and calm your body down or calm the system down, noticing more saliva building up in the mouth is like, oh yeah. And then like these little things of signs of like, okay, I'm doing what I'm doing. Like there are those things available to us as tools to help us know we're doing something right. And I think that for a lot of people like this particular client going, if we can do something that makes us feel a difference straight away, then it gives us that like hook and that like, okay, this is a thing. And that was for me with the Oxygen Advantage. How did it started with like trying some breath holds and being like shocked at how bad I was.
Do you remember what your Bolt score was?
Oh, it was less than 10.
Yeah.
I couldn't do 20.
Which isn't that 20. Uncommon, but it would just scary. But yeah, that's less than 10 for people who don't know. They probably will listen, Patrick and I talk about this plenty, but less than 10 is not optimal by any means.
Well, it was like the category I fell into when reading the book, it was like, you've got asthma and I'm like, well, I have. And I was like, I know I've had this injury and but like, I'm feeling quite good now. Yeah. And like, I was running 5Ks at this point. Like I was running a 20-minute 5K. My Bolt score was 10. Within 6 weeks.
So you have a high level of will and motivation, but from
so
just
like,
physiologically,
I'm like crossing the finish line and dying. And
right.
then like, but that's all that was what I knew. Like my mind, I wasn't the most skillful rugby player, but like you wouldn't beat me on like effort and just like I'll just outwork you type of thing.
Love it. Yep.
And I had that, and that mindset tends to get you in trouble sometimes, depending on what the physical activity is that you're doing. You just won't give up. But within 6 weeks, well, the first time I tried some breath holds. Bolt score is terrible. Walking steps, counting steps. Before I got to 20 steps, like I just panicked. I've never suffered with like a panic attack or anything like that, but I just felt like I was suffocating, and I was like, man, and then looking and Patrick saying, well, it should be over 60. And if you're a professional athlete, it should be like 80 to 100.
Right.
And I'm thinking like, there is no way on this earth I'm ever going to get to 100. Like that is, how does someone even do that? Like in my head, I'm like, you've got to be like a free diver or, lo and behold, it took me a long time because I did a lot of stuff wrong. And actually the reason why I did the training with Patrick was not because I wanted to start teaching it. I was, quite happily enjoying the role I was doing as an S&C coach. I was like, this is a thing. I can see it. When I do some of the exercises, I feel better, but I'm not making long-term progress. And there's some markers that I'm absolutely terrible at. Yeah. I need to understand this better just for myself. And that's all it was.
What did you find that you were doing wrong? What was kind of the thing that you were able to put your finger on?
So I was like, so initially it was, and actually Patrick, we had him on our podcast, and like he's like the best bloke. He's like the nicest bloke you've ever met.
He's a great guy.
Message him after, basically read the book and reach out to him on Instagram, whatever. And he's like, "Do you want to come on the podcast?" He's like, "Yeah." And I was like, well, I've just finished reading this book and now I'm talking to the guy. But
I know, it's amazing.
And I message him after I've been trying to do stuff, and I'm like, I'm really struggling. I think I'm dying at like 20 steps. So he's like, he gives me an half an hour Zoom call or whatever for free, just to like basically encourage me to, one with the breath holds, is like actually push through. Mm-hmm. Whereas I was just like wimping out of it. Yeah. So, and he was like, get a pulse oximeter and just see where your blood oxygen is at, because he was like, you'll think, and he was bang on. He was like, when you think you're dying and suffocating, your blood oxygen levels are like barely even dropped if you're at 20 steps. So I'm like doing so I get my pulse oximeter, I'm doing my breath hold, and I look down, I think I'm dying. My diaphragm's like just contracting. What
are you at, like 95, 96?
97.
That's funny. So right within normal range.
That was the tool though for me that actually like broke that mentally. So I knew the rationale and the science, and everyone sort of we explained that carbon dioxide is the stimulus to breathe. That's what's being monitored in the brainstem, and you go, okay, I get that. You go and do a breath hold, and that just, even though you know it like just goes out of the window, and it's like, get me oxygen in, right. And then you look at the pulse oximeter, and that broke that lie that my brain was telling myself. It was like, I know you're fine. So I would actually I would say that out loud in my head, and that's why I now coach people now with breath holds. I'll say it. It's fine. It's fine. Trust it. It's fine. It's fine. It's all okay. And actually, Patrick would say like, relax into the breath hold, and I couldn't do that for probably about 2 years, or at least I couldn't relax into it because I would just tense against it, and I'd hold tension high up.
Yes.
A lot was to do with sort of the poor mechanics of not having that freedom in my rib cage,
right,
and holding tension higher up, and that like lack of movement from those lower ribs, affecting how well I could actually get the diaphragm to function. And
there's been some really interesting research that I was looking at that looked at EMG, or basically muscular activity for free divers when they're doing breath holds. And so they put these EEG electrodes like on the intercostal muscles of these free divers, and then all around in different areas where you would expect them to tense up when they're doing these extremely long breath holds, or they're doing like a CO2 table. And what they found is that like it is very rare for these individuals until like the very end of their breath hold to like tense their muscles like whatsoever. They are so relaxed into the breath hold. It's just incredible, where it's like, I know for me, I'm probably a little bit better at it than what I used to, but for me, it was like almost like after about 10 seconds of a breath hold, like my body would just tense up. And then I wasn't until I learned how to kind of like relax into the breath hold that I found out that, oh man, that amount of muscular tension was using so much oxygen, number one. Exactly. It was a ton of oxygen use and energy use. And so I was like, I couldn't hold my breath nearly as long until I just finally relaxed into it, which is very much a psychological thing because, when we hold our breath, our instinct is that like, are we holding our breath because we're dying? Like, are we underneath water right now? And so the natural inclination is that the body wants to say, okay, well, it must mean that we need to fight to get out of it. And so what do? We tense ourselves up. But until we, regulate that and train that, like our breath hold time's not going to get much better because for us, we can develop a little bit of CO2 tolerance, even though we're tensing up, but not nearly as much when we learn to relax into it. And we tell the brain, we're not dying. Like, I'm not going to pass out here and then just like not breathe anymore and just be, non-existent. So it's a really interesting practice. Hey, Jay here. Hate to interrupt the show, but I have to tell you about our amazing sponsor for today's episode. Yeah, it's Hanu Health. That's Hanu Health, my company. And I've got good news and I've got bad news. So the bad news is that I'm going to have to be quite cryptic for a while as to what we're building. But what I can say is that it is in the space of health technology, and it's going to be revolutionary. Just think about this show. You have myself, who is an expert in heart rate variability, and Patrick, who is an expert in breathwork, and he is one of our primary advisors. And what's the good news? Well, even though you have no idea about what the company is offering as a product, we are offering an exclusive VIP waiting list so that you can be the first to know about it. Not only will you reserve your spot in line, you will also gain access to our informative newsletter. We will update you on where we are as a company and provide special incentives and promotions. All you need to do is go to hanuhealth.com/waitlist. That is hanuhealth.com/waitlist. I promise you will not want to miss out on what is to come. We are building the biohacker's dream, but it will be useful for every human being on this planet. I'm not even speaking in hyperbole. I'm serious. Every human could benefit from what we are making. So again, head on over to hanuhealth.com/waitlist to get your spot now, and I will just, leave you with bated breath. I think it might be even helpful too, just for listeners who aren't aware of like why you would even breath hold in the first place and why would you walk in breath hold. Would you mind sharing a little bit about how you've used that, kind of why you use it, and then also too why you share that with clientele?
Yeah. So like we mentioned about that CO2 tolerance, or the CO2 carbon dioxide being the stimulus to breathe. So every cell in our body needs oxygen and produces carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide has to, one, it does have to leave the body, but two, it plays some vital roles within the body in terms of helping with circulation, helping with oxygen being released from red blood cells into the tissues themselves. So it's also one of the main things that the respiratory center in the brainstem is monitoring to tell us when to take our next breath, that desire, that stimulus to breathe. And so when we breathe poorly, when we breathe dysfunctionally, one of the things of that is like more mouth breathing and faster breathing rates, and that gets rid of too much carbon dioxide. And so when we become too sensitive to carbon dioxide because we've just getting used to getting rid of it all the time, anytime we hold the breath or anytime we try and slow our breathing down, we get these impulses to breathe. And when it gets really bad, like our impulse to breathe in might have started or be kicking in before we've even finished our exhale. So if we then can't exhale well, that's going to affect like your diaphragm, your rib movement, like the mechanics and the biochemistry, like linking together a lot of the time for people at that point. So practicing exposing the body to higher levels of carbon dioxide to reset these chemoreceptors, basically reset the sensitivity of the respiratory center, the brainstem, so that you can tolerate high levels of carbon dioxide, which helps with our oxygen efficiency and delivery to the tissues, but equally helps us slow our breathing rates down, will then therefore help us be calmer, or help things like your heart rate variability.
Indeed.
But your exercise efficiency, that was a huge thing for me in the marathon, which we can touch on later as well. So practicing holding the breath, getting used to, like you said, the mental side of it is probably first where we actually make the biggest improvement. So
sure.
I can take someone, they might be like me and they were like 20 or 30 steps the first time they do it. And we do 15 minutes of practice on it, even virtually via Zoom. I'm just talking to them in their bedroom or whatever. And it's like, they're now up to 45 steps, and we haven't I can't have changed their sensitivity to carbon dioxide in that time. What we've done is we've learned what those feelings are. We've processed that in our mind, and mentally we're able to push through this thing. And like you said, then when you get better at doing that, then you're actually exposing ourselves to those high levels, and we start to see those improvements. We get the drop in oxygen. One of like Patrick talks about it or classifies it as like simulating altitude training. That when we have this like low oxygen and high CO2 effect, it's similar to being and the training effects people get from altitude. So from a sports performance side of things as well, we get some nice improvements in sort of red blood cell production from the lower oxygen that happens from the breath holds. And so if people are looking into that, that's probably like a whole nother sort of like avenue of it. That's some stuff that we're doing. It's interesting to see like how quickly, when you're being coached through it, where you can go from your 20, 30 steps feeling like you're suffocating within 3 or 4 weeks to be up to 100. It's mad the progress we can actually make. And so, and you'll notice real changeable adaptations in how you feel, how you sleep, because you'll be able to, you could take some marks of like your Bolt score or measuring your breaths per minute. Your breathing rate will like start to automatically slow down because you're just reducing this desire to breathe. And so whether you're breathing fast because you're you want to work on your fitness, or whether you're breathing faster because you're stressed or there's other things going on, like that is going to affect your carbon dioxide tolerance. And one way to help improve that is the practicing of breath holds. The other side of it is practicing slowing down our breathing, like the whole sort of breathing light or breathing less, breathing silent, breathing quieter. That was what I was worst at. I could not. I ended up I got on with breath holds because it was like, right, okay, so I get it now. It's a challenge. And I'm like, challenges, I can take on challenges. Like mentally, I'm good at that. Like, let's go. I'll just try harder. With the breath hold, it was like, try harder, you'll get some success.
Right.
With trying to slow down and quieten your breathing and just get used to like a little bit of like slight bit of air hunger just going on in the background, you can't just try harder at that, Jacko. But that was like my only tactic, and so it took me such a long time. And I've had, I guess, probably more profound benefits from actually getting better at that. And even if I stop doing some breath holds for a bit and then really focus, so before my marathon, I was working on like this, like my aerobic efficiency and my breathing efficiency. And I was like, I'm going to run for like, I looked at the winning time for this marathon was like over 3 hours. So I was like, right, the best dude that's ever done this, that's slow, like for a top end marathon run, if you know what I mean. So I'm like going, right, this is going to be brutal for me. Like, I'm not thinking about like trying to be like sub 4 hours. I'm just like trying to get to the end. So I'm like, I'm going to run for a very long time on this day. The more efficient I can be with my breathing, like the better. And so like all my practice was around that. And so I was like, whether I was actually out running, trying to breathe quietly and slowly and letting my nose dictate the pace rather than trying to hit a pace, because when you work from a time, so I want to do this time, you then work out I need to do this pace, and then you're going to train like this. And then if that might make your breathing and the experience of running feel horrendous. Whereas I worked backwards the other way. It was like heart rate stay 180 minus age. And that for me was like 140, or even literally at the start, even like lowered, like just trying to stay at like 130. Your breathing at 130 nasally in and out is like super nice and super slow. And it feels nice and it feels good running. You finish and it's almost like there's no oxygen debt at the end. Like you finish and you're not out of breath. You're just like, okay, cool. And what happened over time, as we start to get better at that, I'd be sort of like, anytime I was tweaking above that like 180 minus age heart rate, I'd noticed my nasal breathing was starting to get a bit like more sucking in. It's like, it's this challenge we've had. But as the weeks went on, it was like, right, I can go for longer because I don't feel tired. So I'm literally not even going fast. And then looking at the pace I'm running at and going, hold on, I'm now running like, I don't know, 6-minute Ks rather than 7-minute Ks, but my heart rate's still only 140. My breathing's super easy. So it's like I'm running faster, but it's taking no more breathing. And I think that was one of the things. That was one of the things I wanted to. I wanted to take everything from the oxygen advances that I'd learned and go, this research paper says this, and this is why we're going to do it like this. And okay, brilliant. Like, love it, brilliant, let's go. And then it was like, right, I'm going to do that in the marathon, and let's see how it goes down. Put the theory to the test. And I in training didn't go that well in that I never ran more than a half marathon. And I remember telling some people, they were like, "What? You've never ran further than a half?" They were like, "This is going to hurt." Like on the day, I'm like,
right.
People are just chatting as we go around. It's like, yeah, this is going to be interesting. Everyone's talking about you're going to hit the wall at like 18 miles or 20 miles. I mean, I didn't go very fast. It took me 4 hours, 53 minutes, but I never hit the wall.
Yeah.
I remember turning to someone at 24K. I said to this lady, we even got lost, and she managed to get us back on track. And I said to her, look, I said to her, have you done many marathons before? She's like, yeah, she's done a few. And she looks quite comfortable. And she was smiling. It's like, okay. And we're like 24K in. So I'm like, yeah, you're doing all right. And she goes, and what about you? And I was like, oh, this is my first one. And she's like, okay, so how's training? How did training go? I'm like, well, this is quite an exciting time for me because I've never ran this far. Like we're at 24K. She was like, take it easy because we've got another 20K to go. And,
right.
But yeah, I stuck to my guns and I just stayed at that pace. Interestingly,
did you nasal breathe the entire time, or was it most of the time?
Yeah, 100 all the time.
100%
all the time.
of the time.
And
that's awesome.
People. So when I first tried to nasal run, I couldn't get to the end of my road, which is 50 meters. And there was just like snot pouring down the face.
Yes, I remember that when I first started doing it. It was awful. I would have this, we try to keep this as PG as possible on Hanu Health, but I was shooting snot rockets like out of my nose because I was like, I want to keep going, I keep nasal breathing, but I can't do it unless I clear. And so like it was so gross, but I was like, I got to stick to my guns.
and that's one of the challenges for people if you can't leave your ego at the door when you go out for a run for the first time and you're going to nasal breathe, if you've been a mouth breather, your nose will be blocked. Yeah. Your nose won't stay clear if you don't use it. But if you do use it, it'll stay clear. So I was one of those guys. And yeah, it's tougher, it's harder. And actually for most people, it will just stop you like, I can't do this. And then you give up on it. Whereas what we need to do is practice using your nose, use the breath holds to clear it, slow down your pace to just a pace. And if that has to be walking for a first week or a very, very slow jog for your first week, like do that, because what you're going to get is then the benefits of the nasal breathing afterwards. And
what are the benefits? Let's jump into that. So what are the benefits from nasal breathing for performance, and then maybe in general as well, just in case people aren't aware?
One thing in terms of mechanically helping us to, we're not that we necessarily 100% will, but we're more likely to breathe with the diaphragm when we're nasal breathing. There's more of a connection with the diaphragm rather than that shallow upper chest breathing, which is more related to that stressful state. So if I'm running during my marathon, it's fairly stressful on the body because we're running for so long. Do I want my breathing to like emphasize that stress state, or can I get my breathing to be calmer and a bit more relaxed? So nasal breathing will help with that from the perspective of like what we're getting the movement of the diaphragm and all the vagus nerve stimulation we'll get from that. But a lot of it in terms of from sport and exercise being that efficiency of oxygen delivery in terms of like the nose providing resistance to our breathing, which will help slow it down. And when we're able to slow down our breathing, this is where it's one of those things at first. You try and slow down your breathing at first with nasal breathing, it feels horrendous. So not only is your nose blocked, you're like feeling like you're out of breath and what's that feeling of out of breath like? What's it coming from? It's coming back to that CO2 tolerance. Those CO2 levels rising, your body can't currently deal with it. But when you get better at dealing with it, not only does oxygen get released from red blood cells more easily and efficiently, your body will be better at buffering all the H plus ions, lactic acid that's coming as a result of that CO2 production, and the whole system then starts to become more efficient.
Right.
And when I was really struggling during the marathon, like towards the end, I put into practice the idea of like larger breaths, but taking less of them per minute, slowing the breathing rate down, but taking proportionally larger. So still getting the same volume of air in, but not losing as much air in dead space. And I would go from I would do say like 10 of those in a row. People probably thought I was crazy. I'm like running up this hill. And at this point, people are just walking up the hill. They just give up. And I'm like, I had two rules. One was don't walk. And the second one was enjoy it. That's what I wanted out of the marathon. There was no time. It was like, don't walk and enjoy it. So I didn't walk. And so I'm like jogging around. I'm like going, Even with my hands, I was doing this, like,
Yes.
to try and help that move.
Some Tai Chi move. I like it.
Yeah. But how my legs then felt after doing like sort of like 5, 6, or 10 breaths like that, like I could tangibly feel that like oxygen or feeling of energy or whatever, like getting into my legs, and it 100% works. Yeah. I did a little video as I was running along doing it, like literally saying this, going like this is what I'm doing, this is how I feel, like this stuff works, and it's not just a research paper, it's there, and it works. But you've got to do the work to get the benefits.
Indeed.
If you might already be a nasal breather just because you've got good habits, and then you go out for and you're going to feel good and you'll be like, yeah, this is great, yeah, Jacko, woo, yeah, do the nasal breathing. But if you're not a nasal breather when you're asleep, or when you're just doing the dishes, or when you're on your computer, and you've got a dysfunctional breathing but you're not aware of it, you'll hear nasal breathe, that's going to be better for you, and like all this stuff, and then you go out and try it and it feels horrendous.
Yeah, indeed.
Because you're just not adapted to it.
Sure. Indeed.
So we just have to do a little bit of work but the benefits are there for you. Right. And the benefits, if you use them in your exercise, it means that people that exercise, you can do it when you're exercising. Therefore, it's not an extra job for you to do during the day.
Right. Right.
I think the first podcast you did with Patrick, he said something that well, everything he says resonates with me. But he said one thing that resonates with me, of that he was like, you asked him what's his breathing, he's like the guy, like what's your breathing
daily routine? Yeah.
He's like, well, I'm a pretty busy guy. Like, he's writing books for fun and he's got this, and he was like, for me, it has to just be part of my everyday living and everyday life and activities. And that is the key. When you give people more stuff to do, what do clients say? If they feel like you've got to do half an hour of breathing here, then you've got to do it here, then you've got to do it here. They're like, I just can't fit it in. I've got too much stuff going on. Yeah. I'm passionate about and feel a bit of a mission of like, I want to try and make breathwork normal. Like you were saying, like it doesn't, I'm down with like, let's put a bandana on and like play a guitar and like go, woo, I'm right. Down with that. That's what I want to do. But that's going to be a barrier for a lot of people. And actually, you said it right at the beginning. Breathing is for everyone. We're all doing it. Yeah. So you're going to get most benefit out of changing your breathing for 23 hours of the day rather than just 1 hour where you sit on your yoga mat and practice breathing. Yes. If you breathe poorly for the other time, it's going to have little to no effect. Right. So if you're already exercising, start thinking about how you breathe before you exercise, how you breathe during exercise, how you're going to breathe during your recovery, and then how you're sort of breathing when you're warming down afterwards. And you can just like package it up in stuff you're already doing. And that's the key to, I think, for a lot of people to be able to make it consistent. How can I package it into what I already do?
Yeah, it's got to be sustainable. And one of the things that I always tell kind of the people that I work with any clientele, I say, if you could just make one change, like I'm not even telling you to set aside, 5 minutes, let alone an hour. I just want you to, I don't even want you to set aside time. I just want you to tune in and be a little bit more focused of your breath in general. That's number one. And then number two, just see what you can do to transition yourself from mouth breathing to nasal breathing, because a lot of people probably don't even understand the fact that they're mouth breathers until they notice that they're mouth breathers. They transition to nasal breathing, which, like we said, can be difficult at first, because you're talking about with your mouth, you can breathe in a lot of air really quickly, right? Even though you're just breathing it thoracically, like in the chest, you can get a lot in really quickly. Whereas when you breathe through your nose, you are forced to slow down. There's a lot more resistance there, but you have so many other things that are happening physiologically, right? Like the increase in NO or nitric oxide. You have the ability to slow down and engage in a more deeper breath. And we'll talk about LSD breathing here in just a second. And no, I'm not talking about drug-related breathing. I'll explain it here in just a second. I've had people have like, LSD breathing? Is that you pop some LSD and then you breathe? Yeah, exactly. It's just finding what is the most sustainable thing. And I think, again, it's just number one is just being self-aware and being in tune with your breathing. And then if you want to take it to the next step, then we start to introduce it into exercise. Maybe we do set a little bit of devoted time to breathing. Like, that's fine. But am I saying like everybody needs to drop what they're doing, be a yogi, and like go sit out a mat for, an hour, 2 hours and just breathe? Like, if you have the ability to sustain that as a part of your lifestyle and it benefits you, I'm not holding you back from it. You go for it. But for the bulk majority of us, It's just a matter of building it into the small sections and throughout our day. That's going to really help. And I think that there is such a compounding effect with breath work, right? Like the more we do it and the more we're going to condition the nervous system and our physiology to respond that way in times where we're not necessarily thinking about it, like when we're stressed, because we know when we're stressed, our body naturally kind of kicks into high fight or flight sympathetic gear. And what that means is we start breathing thoracically, like from our chest. We start mouth breathing, like we're not focusing kind of in the way that we should. We're just trying to get out of the threat that's, in front of us. Whereas if we continue to train the body, no, I'm not going to respond to a threat by doing kind of all these other things that can be detrimental because I kind of sustain them for a long period of time. I'm now going to focus on what can help me. Nasal breathing, low, slow, deep breathing. All of these things can be conditioned. And, I always tell people too, from birth, like we breathe in a very proper way. However, at some point in our life, whether due to, compounding stress or whatever it may be, we fade away from that. And really, we're just kind of getting back to the basics. We're getting back to the basics of how we are built and designed to breathe. And, again, we don't have to just throw everything, under the kitchen sink at it to begin with, because again, that's not sustainable. It's like me taking somebody who does a standard American diet and says, I'm going to make you, a carnivore or a vegan, like, within the snap of a finger. Doesn't happen. People don't make change like that. They make change in small little chunks. And then they also have to say, number one, I know that this can benefit me, and then they experience it and say that, yes, this is benefiting me, because otherwise, like, what reason do they have to continue to kind of engage in this behavior that isn't kind of a part of their normal daily routine? So that's kind of how I frame it to them, and it sounds like, you do the same.
Yeah. No, I love how you say there about that awareness of your breathing and the nervous system and your levels of stress. And I think I was certainly like this, and I think a lot of people will be the same. You might have been have these like sort of low levels or even chronic levels, but just like have periods of time during your day where you're stressed, but you're completely unaware of it.
Yeah.
You start engaging in this idea of like, I'm going to think about my breathing, and you might not even think of it in relation to stress. It's like, I'm going to try and breathe. Like for me, it was like, I'm going to breathe better so I can get better at my 5K. Like I knocked a minute off my 5K time in 6 weeks from just nasal breathing and doing really bad breath holds. Like I was just not good, but I'd knocked a minute off, and I was like, wow, like this is a thing. But with the relating that sort of like breathing stress. So I was like, I'm going to work on my breathing to help me with my exercise. And then it's like, oh, okay. And then with my rehab of my brain, when I started to understand that. But what I started to realize and notice afterwards was like, breathing is a great, like understanding how you're breathing in lots of different scenarios is a great tool for like being able to listen to what your body's trying to say to you in terms of like how you're feeling and levels of stress. And if you're like me, my body, like I play in rugby, like a sport like that where you're just getting battered all the time. Like you play pretty much every game of your life with some sort of injury. Like you train yourself to like ignore pain and just like carry on. Whereas, if you're quite in tune with your body, like my sister recently has been through breast cancer and come out the other side of it, or fell. But she's very in tune with her body, and she went to the doctor saying she thinks she's got like a lump on her breast, and had her examinations. No, there's nothing. Just went and sent away. She would not leave until she was like, I know that I understand you can say you can't feel anything. But I know that there's something there. Like, I just know it. My body is telling me, like, she's very in tune with herself. And lo and behold, she had like a 7-centimeter tumor in her, in her breast with the doctor. But it was so thin, it was just long.
Yeah.
Like
Wow.
The doctor, he couldn't feel it. But she wouldn't leave until he referred her on for a scan. So, whereas I'm like totally not in tune with my body. But then starting to think about your breathing, it was like, well, you know what? When I'm doing the washing up, I hold a little tension here. Why am I doing that? Like I don't actually feel stressed right now. Or when I'm like rushing around because I'm late for a meeting, I'll notice that I'm like mouth breathing and like and being like this, and I'm like, why am I doing that? Like, so it almost like the starting to think about my breathing started to become the gateway to like listen to what my body and nervous system was trying to say to me, and then it was like, I now know in these types of situations and scenarios, I'm more prone to wanting to be like stressed when I don't need to be. And I can use my breathing as the signaling of like, if I'm getting that way, And then as well, I'm able to use my breathing by slowing it down, getting control of it as the tool to be able to not get into that state of stress that I don't want to be at. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about it. It can be the signal to us as well as the tool to actually be able to calm us down and control the nervous system.
Yeah, well said. It's know thyself in order to increase your awareness of what's going on and then your ability to self-regulate. And I think that is just the beautiful story of how we're built as human beings, how we're designed as human beings. We're designed to have these kind of innate radars that will signal us to become aware of when we're stressed. And then we, again, have these innate things that we utilize all the time, every day without even thinking about it, our breath, to self-regulate. And that is just, I think it's one of the most beautiful pictures of who we are as human beings, is that we have been designed with this built-in mechanism that as long as we are aware of it, which we can become disconnected very easily from it, but as long as we reconnect with it and then re-engage, like we can self-regulate. And that is just an amazing aspect of humanity. One thing I was gonna ask you about, because we kind of hit on it too, and you have already mentioned how this is probably or arguably one of the most powerful tools that you use. Let's talk about LSD breathing, because I know I mentioned it earlier. Can you explain a little bit about what this low, slow, diaphragmatic, or deep, as we refer to it as LSD breathing? Explain a little bit about kind of how somebody goes about engaging in LSD breathing, and then just a little bit about what's going on behind it. Like, why would we utilize this technique?
Yeah, and I think this, I've probably got some...
And I said low, slow. I meant to say light, sorry.
Light, slow, and deep, because I struggled with it so much, I explored a lot of different ways of trying to do it effectively. And so I think that's a bit of a story of my life. When you get stuff wrong a lot of the times, it actually makes you quite much better at teaching something, but it's frustrating at the time. I wish I could just get, but if you're able to just do something straight away, you try and explain someone else how to do it, and they're having loads of trouble with something. It's like you've not been through any of their troubles, so you actually haven't really got, not necessarily empathy, but you haven't really got any of that experience to give them tools to be able to do it. And I think one thing that I find really helps people is using the sound as a little bit of a marker. So you just start to go, if you just, even as people are listening to this now, when in the periods where me and you shut up, they can try to. Can you hear your own breathing? Just tune into the sound that it's making. Don't worry about the movement to start with. And as you start to tune into the noise you're making, can you start to slow it down? And the only way you can slow down your breathing, try to make it quieter is what I mean. Sorry. The only way you can make your breathing quieter is by breathing more slowly, softly, and gently,
right?
And that can be a great little just tool for people to practice with, and just use that as the marker. And what you'll find is that the more you try to quieten it, it'll gradually slow down. At some point, you're going to get this feeling of air hunger, or this feeling of I want to breathe a bit faster or a bit. And ultimately, it would then be a little bit louder. And it's just trying to manage that so you're not going too far in one direction. In terms of the depth of it, I think that this is something that a lot of I was the same as well when I started. When we think of deep, we sort of think of big, but it's deep. It's not saying big. So the size of the breath when we're breathing quietly and softly will be small, but the depth meaning that it's coming from that lower region. It's coming from that diaphragm. So trying to feel that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be at this gigantic breath just for it to be deep. I think that's one of the little misconceptions that comes in a lot of the time. If I get a lot of people say, I just don't feel like I'm getting a full breath in. And I'm like, well, are you running really fast? Because you don't need a full breath in.
Exactly.
You're just sat here chatting, and there's this misconception that I need to breathe these big breaths. And
forceful breathing too. A lot of people, I think they think that they have to force it. They have to kind of really dig deep into it. And they're like, this feels kind of stressful. I'm trying to expand my lungs as wide as they can get. And to kind of your point there is the idea isn't that we kind of force so much oxygen into our lungs that it expands to where we're feeling uncomfortable. For me, I almost sometimes will visualize that breath, right? I'll visualize it kind of going as deep deep and as low as it possibly can, and kind of starting at the bottom and almost like feeling its way up and then to the side, laterally. And I think for a lot of people too, like I say, like if you feel like it's forceful and that you're having to kind of like use a lot of your volition, then you're probably doing too much work. Right? And you probably just need to, again, slow it down, become light, and then allow the body to relax, allow the diaphragm to move towards the pelvic floor, because there's so much benefit in doing that, because when our lungs expand due to the kind of extension or descension of the diaphragm, that actually can increase our ability to tap into vagal tone, tap into the vagus nerve. It's an incredibly important aspect. So I tell people to really focus on that, but not be overly concerned with trying to force air down deep, because for a lot of them, it just ends up being more stressful.
Yeah, and it's one of these challenges of like, we want our breathing to be nice and easy and effortless, but if I'm going to try to change a habitual habit that I've got, it's not going to be effortless for me to now change from mouth breathing, upper chest breathing, to nasal breathing, nice diaphragm breathing, and nice movement of the ribs, where I haven't really had that before. I'm going to have to think about it. I'm going to have to concentrate. I'm going to have to try and do it. And like you said, like, trying too hard is not helpful, but equally at the start, to retrain a movement pattern, just the same way if someone's got a really bad squat that they want to improve, I've got to do some work on them in terms of like strengthening different areas, loosening off different bits, but I've got to also like teach them that new movement pattern. They've got to like do many reps in to start with. It feels really hard. They're struggling to get their hips back or whatever it may be. And it's exactly the same with breathing. It's still a movement pattern. The ribs are moving, the diaphragm's moving, its muscles are making that whole thing happen. And you've got to be trying at first, and it's that double-edged sword again, like trying but not trying too hard, but it's going to feel like that. And I've had clients that are a few things that commonly happen. Say for instance, we're talking about this diaphragm breathing, and people are like pointing at their stomach area again, like, I don't know if I'm using it, or how do I know if it contracts as you breathe in, as it goes down? Can you feel that contraction? I always say, like, if I ask you to tense your bicep, you can tense that and you can feel the squeeze. And it's like, well, how can you do that compared to with your diaphragm? And we have a neural connection from the brain to the bicep because you've done that many times before. You know what it feels like. Whereas if you've not really been engaging that diaphragm, the ribs haven't been given the room for it to be able to work, then maybe you haven't got that great a neural connection to the diaphragm, and you try to do it and you literally can barely even feel anything. Right. That's where like blocked inhalations and even in breath holds, where it gets stimulated almost on its own rather than you being in control of it, you'll feel it tugging down whilst you're holding on the breath, and you'll like go, oh crikey, that I can feel it now. Like I do, blocked inhalation would be like, take a breath in, take a breath out, pinch the nose, try and breathe in. When you're not allowing air to come in, that diaphragm sort of like tugs down.
Yep.
There's no air coming in, and then it's like, for a lot of people, they're like, oh, okay. That's what it feels like. It's like, yeah, that's that. Try and recreate that. But some people, to start with, it's like they do that. There's nothing. They cannot like send a signal to the diaphragm, and it's like we need to guide ourselves into being able to use it. Just like any muscle within the body. Like if you're rehabbing, someone blows their shoulder up and the rotator cuff needs to be rehabbed. We need to be able to activate it before we can strengthen it.
Right.
And a lot of time, like rehabilitation work would be like, we do like some very low level, but often it'd be like isometric work in mid range, because that's the easiest place to activate a muscle, and that blocked inhalation is a little bit like that. It's effectively more like an isometric, because you're not letting it actually move, and you're going to be somewhere in that mid range likely. But
I really like that conceptualization, right, of really trying to rehab both your lungs and rehab your diaphragm, because if you haven't used something in a really long time, or maybe we should say you haven't used it nearly as effectively or as efficiently in a really long time, then it's going to take some time. There's going to be almost like some atrophy that you got to strengthen, and so
for sure.
Yeah, and so I think it's one of those things just to remember that if it's difficult at first, it's just because, you've been unfortunately breathing dysfunctionally for quite some time, and you're not alone, right? This is not an uncommon theme. This is actually the majority.
Right? Yeah. If it wasn't difficult and you were like, oh yeah, no, got that, it probably means that you weren't really doing it that bad anyway. Like that's a good thing. Whereas if you're finding it really hard, then it's a bigger sign of like, well, yeah, this is something you need to do and think on. I think
yeah.
the other sort of misconception that some people struggle with, a little bit linked to sort of like belly breathing over compared to this concept of like pushing into the belly compared to actually using the diaphragm, the ribs moving. But the fact that, and I'm still, I don't know whether the exact, I think there's a number of reasons why people do this, but like holding too much tension, almost like sucking their stomach in, or holding tension through their abdominal muscles. And I think sometimes it's literally because we might be like sucking in to make ourselves, we used to, I don't know, maybe we still wear a pair of jeans that are probably a bit too small for us.
Could be it.
You know, but literally like we almost subconsciously, just because of like our image or whatever we think of, we're actually sucking in to make ourselves look or appear or feel a bit thinner.
Right.
But what that's doing is it's holding the ribs in, and it's actually like stopping you from, you'll feel a load of stuff down by your, down in your like abdominal region, but actually you tensing your ab muscles, which is affecting you from being able to like get that nice rib movement laterally to create that space for the diaphragm. And I think that again then comes down to like a habitual thing of like, how long have I been doing this? How much easier do I find it to contract my abs compared to contracting my diaphragm? Can I actually let go? And this is a big one that like people struggle to let go. It's almost like muscular tension and the emotional side of it of like, what does that mean when you let go of your of your abdominal muscles and you actually relax? Like, can you let go? There's I don't know. I'm not a psychologist or anything. It's all, but I definitely feel there's something behind that, and we're like holding on. But then when we do let go, we can let those ribs move and we can let the diaphragm move. But there's, I'm appreciative that I ain't got the answers of that, but I appreciate that it's a physical thing that I'm sort of like seeing and trying to provide a solution of. But I feel that there's more than just the physical that's potentially at play there.
No, I would absolutely agree. You know, one of the greatest things that I've heard Patrick talk about, and he was one of the first people who I really heard talk about this, is that so many people will really try to kind of like force their stomach in and out. And they'll like, you know, a lot of people are taught breath work by putting the hand kind of like on the lower part of their belly, which again, not necessarily inherently bad, but a lot of people are like just trying to force in and out kind of the hand movement. And I like that Patrick's like, well, instead, let's actually kind of put the hands kind of on the lower part of the ribs and actually try to feel the lateral expansion of the ribs on the in and out breath. And I have found that to be much more effective for me, because when I focus on kind of moving the hand, when I place it on the belly with each breath, I find myself forcing the hand forward and back.
Forward,
Yep. And I don't feel
with a resistance band like all the way around you. So you'll feel not just that lateral expansion, you'll feel it like into the back, into the posterior parts as well. And everyone's different. Some people find it, I mean, I had a conversation with a friend recently. He's like, he feels that actually he's started like he's got on board with like the lateral expansion. He's got like so laterally feels like now he's lacking actually the other dimension, breathing into the back and even breathing forwards. Like so he's become almost one dimensional isn't the right word because it's, you know what I mean? Like we should be three dimensional, but he's ended up going that way. And so anything that's going to help you feel like you're getting that three-dimensional expansion, and if this is where there's not always one solution for every person, because if someone is breathing, if someone hasn't got that lateral expansion, then they need that lateral expansion. But if they've got that, but they're not breathing into the back at all, then they need to think about that. So it's just trying to find out for yourself, like, where am I breathing into? And it comes all the way back down to what you said right at the beginning around like awareness. Like, if we're not aware of how we're breathing, you're not going to be able to put any of this stuff into practice and make those changes. So it always starts with that awareness.
No, indeed. Self-awareness and then self-regulation, kind of a key component here at Hanu Health, as we say that when you get those two components right, I mean, that's kind of the recipe for health and optimization. I mean, it's not easy. I mean, it's difficult sometimes to be self-aware, and sometimes it hurts to be self-aware of kind of like identifying, oh, you know what, I'm not feeling so great. I'm kind of stressed, or, you know, I'm engaging in dysfunctional breathing. A lot of us, like when we become aware of those things, we're like, I don't have time for that. So we kind of push it to the side. And we're like, well, the great thing though is that you don't really have to take any time out of your day to really just focus on self-regulating through your breathing. You're going to breathe anyway, right? Just do it the right way. And if you do it the right way, you're going to like reap those huge benefits. So again, some key tenets for us as well. So I know we're getting a little bit long here, and I don't want to wrap some things up, but the one thing that I wanted to punt to you, because I'm really interested in kind of like, I always love kind of like concluding a podcast with like, okay, brass tacks, like, you know, rubber meets the road. Like, what is like something that our listeners, like if they have heard this maybe for the very first time, they're being introduced to kind of like Breathwork, Oxygen Advantage, your work, like what would you, Jacko, say that for you, the lowest hanging fruit, like here's something that you can start, anyone can do today? Like what's kind of the order of priority for you? Like what would you tell somebody?
That's good. What did you say? The brass. There was a phrase.
Getting down to brass tacks.
The brass tacks. Well, yeah, brass tacks.
Yes.
I actually wrote in this blog I've been writing about reflecting on the marathon. A phrase that someone once said in a rugby huddle that almost made us all laugh. But he said he goes, "Talk is cheap. Money buys the whiskey." You get your wallets out. So I love it. We've done a lot of talking, but it's like, what is actually going to make the difference?
Exactly. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I mean, some of it's like going to be a little bit sort of banging the same drum that we've already said. So it's like I'm like, part of me wants to like try and come out with something like a bit like, well, a bit different and a bit, but it's not the right message. Like we've talked a lot about nasal. Where it's at. We've talked a lot about nasal breathing, and it is like, can you start breathing through your nose? Can you start to just be aware, even if you're like sort of a little bit brand new to this, just ask yourself the question, how am I breathing? And you're either breathing through your nose, you're breathing through your mouth, or you don't know. And all of those are fine, because the first step is awareness. When you then know your mouth breathing, you're going to be able to think. Okay, just by listening to this podcast, you're going to be thinking tomorrow or later on today about nasal breathing, and you're going to try it. And if it's what we said before, if it feels harder, that is a sign, not that it's bad, not that you're any different. Like you got made just like the rest of us. So we all got given a nose to breathe through. If it feels hard, then it's a sign that you need to do it, and you need to spend some time thinking about addressing that. And I promise you, your body is going to thank you for it. Your body will feel better. Your mind will be better. Everything is going to be better from improving your breathing. If breathing through your nose is super easy and super fine, like maybe you don't breathe that dysfunctionally. Maybe you're on a pretty good gauge with it. Like keep going with that. And if you want to push into it a little bit more, then you can start to think about what's it like when we up the ante a little bit and we're starting to get into exercise and that type of thing. But that first thing of get that awareness, breathe through the nose. If it feels harder, don't give up on it and take that as a this isn't for me. Like that's not I've had someone say it before. It's not really. Sort of like the whole breathing thing. It's not really for me.
Breathing, don't need that.
You're gonna die. You're gonna die. But the body's amazing at adapting, right? Like that's the thing we're best at. So you're not actually going to die. We're all going to die at some point and take our last breath. But why not enjoy it a little bit better? I sort of describe it as almost like the diaphragm doesn't have too many jobs to do. Okay, like we can talk about intra-abdominal pressure and that type of stuff of stabilizing the spine, but generally his job is like to breathe. Like, don't take that away from him. It's the same with the nose. Like the nose is there for breathing. Like let him do his job.
Right.
Rather than like taking it away from him. The mouth's got to do with talking, eating, chewing, all that. Like you don't need another job to do. So I tend to sort of break it, try and make it a bit simple to fathom and take it in that way.
I love it, man, dude. Simple, sweet. I mean, it's something that everybody needs to hear. And even those of us who are listening to this podcast who are, well trained in breath work. It's like you said from the very beginning, like we're always evolving kind of in our practice, in our knowledge, in our understanding. And so we can fall back into old habits easy. Like old habits die hard, but we can get through them and we can create new helpful habits, but we can fall back into those old ways easy. So for us, we're always going to be learning kind of how to better become more self-aware of dysfunctional breathing, of our stress response. And then we're always going to learn kind of new, unique ways to self-regulate self-regulate. That's kind of just one of the greatest aspects of humanity. So, dude, that's that's some great information that you provided us today. I really hope that this has just been so practical for all of our listeners. I know it has been. One of the things that we'll do too is I'm going to link everything that we have today into our show notes, hanuhealth.com/podcast. Jacko, tell people how they can find you.
My website is rootedlife.co.uk. Probably Instagram's the best place to see what's going on.
You're active Jacko. Like that. I mean, just filming during your marathon. I've seen you've always got your Breathe Right strips, your mouth tape on. I love it.
It was like I'm throwing the whole kitchen sink at this baby.
You got to, man.
So Instagram is Jacko Human Flag.
Awesome. And you got a podcast. You want to plug your podcast?
Yeah, the podcast it's a movement, strength, and play podcast with School of Calisthenics. So School of Calisthenics is schoolcalisthenics.com, and the Instagram and everything, everything's just School of Calisthenics for that.
Awesome, cool, man. Well, dude, again, thanks so much for coming on. Wealth of knowledge that you brought. Really appreciated you coming on. I'd love to have you back at some point because we didn't even get into things like mouth taping and sleep and kind of all these other areas. So we'll have to have you back on at some point so we can dive into some more subject matter, man.
Yeah, sure, man. I need a new challenge as well. So I need to think of something, and then test out some nasal breathing in a bit of a different way, and then come back.
Indeed. I love it, man. Hey, dude, thanks again. We appreciate you having you on. And also, too, anybody who's, listening, if you guys have questions, we're going to post this on Instagram. And we'll link Jacko and his Instagram account there. So feel free to ask. If anything, again, I hope you all just have a wonderful week. And we'll see you next Friday here for the Hanu Health Podcast. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Hanu Health Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. This podcast would not happen without listeners and supporters like you. And the best way to support us and the show is to head on over to iTunes and provide us with a 5-star review. This helps us reach others and spread the good word of breathing and stress resiliency. If we read your 5-star review on air, please reach out to podcast@hanuhealth.com with your name and mailing address, and we will send you some sweet Hanu gear. Until next time, breathe better and stress less.